What part of the Elize Alberti story is just a ghoulish Galveston ghost story, and what part is actual true crime in history from 1894, and how can a historian help you tell the difference? I'm PhD Rachel. Let's talk the case of the demented mother of Galveston, Elize Alberti. Trigger warning. What inspired this research rabbit hole was seeing the Lindsay Clancy trial in the news this week with references to the Andrea Yates case in Houston from several decades ago. Like those cases, this case includes postpartum depression, psychosis, self-harm, and harm to children. If that is not something you need to hear this week, keep scrolling and join me later in a different video with a lighter topic. So Elise Romer was born in 1858 in Galveston, Texas, and at age 17, she married a German immigrant named Louis Alberti. She came from a nice family. Louis was a butcher and very well respected in the community. By all accounts, everybody was doing pretty well. Louis Jr. was born a few years later in 1877, followed very closely thereafter by Emma in 1878 and Wilhelmina in 1881. 1884 is a very difficult year for the family and for Elise. She is pregnant with another child when her eldest son dies of tetanus or lockjaw. She then gives birth to Ella, who is a healthy baby girl, and then her sister, who is roughly age 15, passes away as well. Now later, some newspapers, and especially those ghost story sites, will say that her neighbors claimed from this point forward her mind was weak, that she was kind of known as being mentally impaired, that something was very wrong after 1884. But if you go back to the coverage of the newspapers when they were looking at what actually was said in the trial, nobody mentions anything happening in 1884. The couple goes on to have Lizzie, named after her mother, in 1886, Dora in 1888, and Willie in 1890. They now have 5 daughters and 1 son. So in the summer of 1894 in Galveston, Lizzie is now 37 years old, expecting another child, and this is when things begin to go wrong. Her husband reaches out to her father and tells him, quote, Lizzie is crazy. So her mother and father go to check on her and find her having these crying fits, just raving mad, telling her parents she would not live anymore. This is a really important takeaway from lots of these stories, that what we think of as postpartum depression can begin with mental illness before the birth of the child. That you can have symptoms before you ever get to the postpartum part. According to her father's testimony later, after several weeks under a doctor's care in his home, there is an operation. Baby Caroline is born but does not survive, and Elise is taken to Sealy Hospital for further treatment. Now, at some point during the stretch where she is staying in her father's house in May 1894, she did try to take her own life with a pair of scissors, and she was prevented from doing that. So her family is getting her all the medical care they can, and the husband is still very concerned about what's going on, so he brings a case before the courts charging her with lunacy, trying to have her committed. But his physician tells him that his wife is not bad enough to send off, and so that court case is continued. By all accounts, the doctor meant well here. Galveston was a sickly area, a lot of mosquito-borne illnesses in the 19th century, and he had seen cases where people were running really bad fevers, and that this would lead to all sorts of disturbing behavior, and then if you could get the fever down, those symptoms would stop. And so he wanted to make sure that this wasn't part of running a fever. He does claim at trial that he told her mother to never leave her adult daughter alone. This is the other thing we see in a lot of these cases that should be a big takeaway: miscommunication between healthcare providers, the patient, and their caregivers. This is a moment where we really could have prevented very bad things, and in all of these cases, there is a moment that is missed. After a normal weekend that included visiting family, she takes to bed Monday all day and Tuesday morning feeling ill and with fever. At some point on Tuesday evening, Elise offers 5 of her 6 children sips of wine that she had poisoned with an overdose of morphine. We do not know why she didn't poison Wilhelmina as well, age 14. There are several different versions of this story on the internet. I didn't see any of them pop up in the actual coverage of the trial. In that trial, her husband Louis says he comes home that evening, the kids are crying, he asks what's wrong, and they say mom gave them bitter wine. He asks his wife Elise what's happening, and she very plainly tells him she poisoned the children. The ghost story version makes this more dramatic, having Louis return home after work in the evening, witnessing the children take these sips, asking for a glass of wine himself, not catching that his wife pours him a glass from a different bottle. He has his wine, and then he goes back to work and only comes home when he hears the children screaming. That is not testified to in the trial. Now, according to Lewis's court testimony, after his wife admits that she's just poisoned the children, he calls the doctor, but 4-year-old Willie passes away before the doctor can even arrive to the home. 10-year-old Ella will pass away that evening as well, while Emma, age 16, Lizzie, age 8, and Dora, age 6, still lingered. As these children are inside the house fighting for their lives, onlookers show up outside the house trying to get the latest gossip and see what's going on. In other words, some people have always been terrible human beings when it comes to true crime. One way we can get at the class status of this family is that a newspaper reported that the police were trying to strategize how to get Elise to the jail because it would be untoward to manhandle her. after she poisoned her children. She did go with them and ended up in the jail. Onlookers also went to the jail trying to, I don't know, see or talk to Elize. The jailers turned them away, but they did not turn away a local journalist who thanked them in their newspaper coverage of his interview with the woman who had just poisoned her children and was awaiting trial on lunacy charges. In the end, 16-year-old Emma recovered, but her younger siblings did not. So she and 14-year-old Wilhelmina were the only child survivors. Elise fully admits responsibility for the deaths of her children and expects to be executed by the state, very similar to Andrea Yates in that regard. Her father, her husband, and two doctors all testify that she should not be held responsible, and a jury agrees. She's institutionalized in San Antonio. She will later be released, return to Galveston, and, according to the stories, end her own life. Elise, her husband, several of her children, including those she poisoned, are all buried in a cemetery in Galveston, Texas. And on those ghost story sites, you hear about people going to the cemetery and they tell this story. They don't normally actually get to any haunting, just that the story itself is haunting. One reason it is so haunting is that every few decades we seem to get another one of these cases with so many similarities to Elise's. The good news is we have much better treatments than Elize, even with her family's money and status, would have had in 1894. So, what can we learn from the haunting case of the so called demented mother of Galveston? For starters, these symptoms often start before birth, even though we think of it as a postpartum issue, and the sooner we get people help, the better off their outcomes often are. Second, being that communication between healthcare providers, the patient, and their caretakers is extremely important. Consumers of modern true crime admit to being fascinated by these cases, but also that they want to learn something that might help them prevent these types of tragedies in the future. And hopefully, we leave Elise's case with more knowledge and empathy that will allow us to do just that.